Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that takes, piles of research, source materials, all that dense stuff, and boils it down into the key insights for you.
Yeah, doing the heavy lifting so you get the good stuff.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into something that honestly probably affects every single disagreement you've ever been in, seriously. From, what movie to watch, all the way up to huge political divides.
Those moments where you're just baffled, right?
Yeah.
Looking at the same thing as someone else but seeing totally different realities.
Totally. Think back to maybe the 2000 U.S. election. That whole mess. People on both sides were absolutely convinced the other side was massively biased.
Oh, completely. While officials like Catherine Harris in Florida were saying, nope, I'm perfectly impartial here. Zero bias on my part.
Right. Or maybe something simpler, like watching sports. It's so easy to see the refs bias against your team, right? It's almost funny how obvious it is.
Yeah, you see it clear as day.
But the idea that your team might be bending the rules, or that your own loyalty is maybe, just maybe, coloring how you see things, that thought just doesn't usually land. What is that?
Well, that's exactly it. It's one of the most persistent and, frankly, fascinating quirks of how our minds work, isn't it?
It really is.
This thing where we're just pros at spotting cognitive biases, motivational biases, you name it, in other people.
Yeah.
Effortless.
Yeah.
But turn that spotlight on ourselves. Suddenly we're blind. Almost completely oblivious.
So it's not just a little mistake. It's baked in.
It seems to be. It's fundamental. And that's what we're getting into today.
And that right there is our main topic, the bias blind spot. We often call it BBS for short. This whole deep dive is basically your shortcut to really, truly getting a handle on this.
Yeah, we're going to unpack it. What it is exactly, where it comes from, and the origins might surprise you. They're not always intuitive. We'll look at the psychological gears turning behind the scenes, what creates it.
And then the big one, the impact. Where does this actually show up in the real world? Because it does, a lot.
Big time, across so many areas. And finally, what can we actually do about it? What does the science say about maybe reducing its effects?
So get ready for possibly a few aha moments, this stuff. It might genuinely shift how you see your own thinking, and maybe how you see disagreements too. #TagI, defining the elusive bias blind spot.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then, this blind spot. Lay it out for us. What exactly is the bias blind spot?
Okay, the core idea is this. It's a fundamental asymmetry in how we perceive bias. Put simply, people are way, way less likely to detect bias in their own judgments compared to how easily, almost automatically, they detect it in other people.
So it's not just that I think I'm less biased, it's that I genuinely don't see my own bias as easily.
Precisely. And that word blindness is key. It's not just a version of, the better than average effect.
Right, where everyone thinks they're a better than average driver or
Yeah.
smarter or whatever. Exactly. That's about rating yourself positively on desirable traits. The bias blind spot is specifically about recognizing bias itself. It goes deeper. It's a genuine gap in self-awareness regarding the very processes that might be skewing our judgment.
And you said even when people are taught about biases.
That's the really striking part. You can teach someone explicitly about confirmation bias, say. Explain what it is, how it works, give examples. They'll nod along, understand it intellectually. But then often, they'll still insist it doesn't really influence their own beliefs or decisions. Yet ask them about someone else. They'll spot it in a heartbeat. Oh, yeah, they're definitely doing that.
Wow.
It really highlights that blind spot aspect. It's like a specific part of your own mental landscape is just obscured, even when someone hands you a map.
Okay, that makes it clearer. But then, how on earth do researchers measure this if it's so internal, so invisible to the person experiencing it? How do you put a number on that?
That's a great question because it does sound slippery, right? But they've developed some pretty clever and quite robust methods.
Yeah.
The standard way usually involves giving people descriptions of different well-established cognitive and motivational biases. Sometimes they use neutral terms, like tendency or effect, to avoid putting people on the defensive right away.
Okay, so they describe, the self-serving bias or something.
Exactly. They describe it. Then they ask the participants two key things. First, rate on a scale how susceptible you think you are to this tendency. And second, rate how susceptible you think the average American, or maybe your average classmate, some kind of generalized other, is to that same tendency.
Okay. So it's a direct comparison, you versus them.
Precisely. And to do this reliably, to measure the individual differences and how big this gap is for different people, researchers developed a specific tool. It's often called the Scopoliti scale. named after one of the lead researchers.
A specific scale just for this.
Yes, and it wasn't just thrown together. It started, I think, with something like 27 different bias descriptions, and through a lot of testing and refinement, they narrowed it down to a core set, usually around 14 items now.
Okay.
And this scale is, psychometrically sound. That means it's reliable. It's unidimensional. It measures this one core thing, the bias blind spot. It's internally consistent. The questions all kind of hang together and measure the same construct.
Right.
And it has good retest reliability. If you take it today and then again in a few weeks, your score will likely be pretty similar. It's stable.
So it's a solid research tool. It gives a real number. How do they calculate that score from those comparison ratings you mentioned?
It's actually quite straightforward. For each bias description on the scale, you take the rating the person gave for the average person's susceptibility, and you subtract the reading they gave for their own susceptibility.
Okay, so the difference between how biased they think others are versus themselves.
Exactly. You calculate that difference for each of the 14 or so items, and then you just average those differences together. A bigger average difference means a bigger bias blind spot score. It directly quantifies that gap.
Got it. Can you give us a few examples of the specific biases they use on that scale, just to make it more concrete?
Sure. It covers a real range. You've got the self-serving bias, which we touched on. That's, taking credit when things go well. I aced the test because I'm smart. But blaming external factors when they go badly, I failed because the test was unfair.
Classic. We all do that sometimes, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Then there's confirmation bias. This is huge. It's our tendency to seek out, interpret, and even remember information in a way that confirms what we already believe. We even dig our heels in more when shown evidence that contradicts our view.
Right. You see that online all the time. People finding the one source that agrees with them and ignoring 10 that don't.
Precisely. Or there's the fundamental attribution error. That's where we're maybe too quick to blame victims for their misfortunes. They should have known better. They brought it on themselves, rather than considering the situational factors.
Yeah.
The halo effect is another one. Judging someone positively overall, maybe they're attractive or charismatic, and then assuming they must also be smart, kind, competent, even if there's no evidence for it.
The good-looking people must be good effect.
Sort of, yeah. And of course, stereotyping, making assumptions about individuals based on group membership. Things like, all engineers are like X, or all politicians are like Y. The scale includes these and others, really capturing a wide spectrum of common judgment pitfalls.
Okay, so it's pretty comprehensive, but this still nags at me a bit. Is this bias blind spot really distinct? Or is it just, another flavor of us wanting to feel good about ourselves, like that better than average thing? Is it truly something deeper?
That is a really critical question. And the research points very strongly towards, yes, it is distinct. While it definitely contributes to feeling good about ourselves, it's empirically separate from just general self-enhancement, like the better than average effect.
How do we know that? What's the evidence?
Well, a key piece of evidence comes from developmental psychology. Remember how we said the better than average effect, thinking you're nicer, smarter, faster than your peers, shows up really early? You see clearly in kids as young as 5.
Right. Kindergartners are convinced they're the best.
Exactly. But the bias blind spot, this specific pattern of seeing bias in others much more readily than in yourself, that doesn't reliably show up until middle childhood, usually around ages 7 to 12.
Oh, interesting. So there's a developmental gap.
It's a significant one.
Yeah.
Which strongly suggests they rely on different underlying cognitive mechanisms. The bias blind spot seems to require a more sophisticated kind of thinking about mind and reality that younger children just haven't developed yet.
Okay, that's compelling. And what about intelligence? Surely smarter people, or people who are just generally better decision makers, are less prone to this, right? They must be more self-aware.
You would absolutely think so. It's
Yeah.
probably the most counterintuitive finding in this whole area. But the research consistently shows that the bias blind spot appears to be largely independent of general intelligence, measured by things like IQ tests or SAT scores.
Really?
Largely, yes. It's also independent of what researchers call general decision-making competence skills, measured by tests, looking at things like risk assessment, applying decision rules, things like that. And it's even separate from cognitive reflection.
Cognitive reflection, what's that?
That's your ability to override a quick, intuitive, but wrong answer and engage in deeper thought to get the right one. Think of those tricky brain teaser questions.
Right, so even people good at that aren't protected.
Nope. People who score high on intelligence, decision-making competence, or cognitive reflection are not significantly less likely to show a bias blind spot. In fact, get this, some studies find a small positive correlation.
Wait, positive, meaning smarter people sometimes have a bigger blind spot.
It seems that way in some studies, yes. Perhaps because being smarter gives you better tools to rationalize your own viewpoint and find flaws in others. It's not entirely clear why, but the lack of a negative correlation is the key point. Being smart doesn't grant you immunity at all.
Wow. That's humbling, actually. Okay, so if it's not general self-enhancement and it's not about smarts, does it link up with personality traits? Like, are narcissistic people more prone to it? Or maybe people who score low on agreeableness?
Another great question, and again, the research tends to show it's distinct.
Yeah.
Studies have looked at correlations with things like self-esteem, narcissism, the tendency towards self-enhancement more generally, social desirability, wanting to look good to others, and even the big five personality traits, openness, conscientiousness, etc.
No strong links?
Generally, no strong, consistent links that would suggest the bias blind spot is just another manifestation of these personality factors. It really does need to be its own specific thing, a true cognitive blind spot related to how we process information about ourselves versus how we process it about others.
Which leads perfectly into, okay, why? What's happening in our heads to create this specific kind of blindness?
Right.
If it's not about intelligence or personality, what is going on psychologically? What are the deep roots of this thing where we see bias everywhere except in the mirror?
Okay, so researchers have zeroed in on two main psychological mechanisms that seem to be the primary drivers. They often work together. The first one is called naive realism.
Naive realism. Okay, what's that?
It's this fundamental, often completely unconscious assumption that our perception of the world reflects reality directly, objectively, without any filter. We think we see things exactly as they are.
Like, my view is the true view.
Exactly. It's a very deep-seated egocentric belief. So when someone else sees things differently, especially on an issue we care about, our immediate, almost automatic inference is that they must be the ones who are biased. Or maybe they're irrational, or they're working from bad information, or they have some hidden agenda.
Because my view feels so obviously correct, so real.
Precisely. The idea that our own perspective might be subjective or influenced by our own biases just doesn't feel right. It doesn't compute easily because our reality feels so real.
I can see how that would make it hard to accept your own bias, but does this apply even to things like, say, taste in music or art? That seems purely subjective.
You think so, but the power of naive realism is astonishing. Studies have actually shown that even with things like artistic preference, people will argue that their preferred art possesses some kind of true objective quality. They'll say the paintings they like are objectively better, more balanced, more meaningful.
Seriously?
Seriously. And they'll argue that people who disagree must be biased. Maybe they're just following trends, or they don't have refined taste, or they're influenced by the artist's fame. So even in areas of pure taste, we project our subjective preference onto the world as objective reality. This makes it incredibly difficult to acknowledge our own filters.
Wow. Okay, so naive realism is pillar number one. What's the second mechanism?
The second one is called the introspection illusion. And this one explains why simply trying to look inward and check ourselves for bias usually fails.
The introspection illusion sounds tricky. How does it work?
Well, when we want to figure out if we were biased in a particular judgment or decision, what do we typically do? We introspect. We look inside at our thoughts, our feelings, our motives. We ask ourselves, did I feel any prejudice? Did I have any ulterior motive? Did I consciously try to be unfair?
Right, you kind of mentally scan yourself for bad thoughts or biased feelings.
Exactly. But here's the illusion. Many, probably most, cognitive and motivational biases operate unconsciously. They happen automatically beneath the surface of our conscious awareness. They influence our judgment without us feeling them happen.
So when we look inside,
we find no direct conscious evidence of bias. There's no little alarm bell going off saying, warning, confirmation bias active. Because we don't feel biased and introspection reveals no sign of it, we confidently conclude
that we weren't biased.
Bingo. The lack of an internal signal becomes proof of objectivity. It's a flawed inference, but it feels perfectly logical from the inside.
That's a serious trap. We're looking for something we can't possibly see through introspection alone.
It really is. Now, think about how we judge others. We can't introspect for them, right? We don't have access to their inner thoughts or feelings.
No, of course not.
So what do we rely on instead? We look at their behavior, and we consult our general theories about how people work. Theories like people tend to be self-interested, or people are influenced by their group affiliations, or people get defensive when criticized.
We use these general rules or expectations about human nature.
Exactly.
Sure.
And because we're applying these abstract theories from an outside perspective, without the misleading data from our own introspection, it's much, much easier to spot potential biases in others. Studies back this up beautifully. People ignore how their own predictions deviate from objective benchmarks when assessing themselves, but instantly flag that same deviation as bias when assessing someone else.
It's like we have two totally different toolkits for judging self versus others. One relies on faulty internal feelings, the other on external behavior and general theories.
That's a great way to put it. And it leads to this really fascinating twist, especially when people have strong personal connections to an issue.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Researchers sometimes call it the enlightenment fallacy. It's this tendency for people to see their own personal connection to an issue. Maybe it's their identity, their lived experience, their job, not as a potential source of bias, but as a source of special insight or enlightenment.
So, because I've lived this, I see it more clearly and objectively than you do.
Precisely. My experience gives me unique access to the truth. They feel their connection illuminates the issue for them, making them less biased, more objective.
Okay, I can see people feeling that way.
But here's the kicker. They view the exact same kind of personal connection in their opponents as a clear source of bias.
Ah, so my connection enlightens me, but your connection biases you.
You got it. Think about politicians. One might argue their experience battling a specific disease gives them unique objective insight into healthcare policy. But they might see an opponent's connection to, say, the insurance industry as purely self-serving bias.
Right. Or debates about social issues.
Exactly. Studies have looked at this with, say, Jewish and Arab students discussing the Middle East, or minority versus Caucasian students on affirmative action, or even varsity versus intramural athletes arguing over gym access.
Even athletes.
Wow.
Yep. In each case, people saw their own group's connection as providing clarity and objectivity, while the other group's identical connection was seen as a source of irrational bias and self-interest. This "I'm enlightened, you're biased" stance just digs the bias blind spot in even deeper. It makes compromise almost impossible if you think your side has the objective truth thanks to experience, while the other side is blinded by theirs.
That really explains a lot about why some debates feel so stuck. Okay, so these mechanisms are powerful. But are we born with this blind spot, or does it kick in later? You mentioned the developmental difference with the better-than-average effect earlier.
Right, and that developmental story is key. Research strongly indicates the bias blind spot is not something we're born with. It's generally absent in early childhood, say ages 5 to 8.
So little kids, they don't show it. Typically, no. What's fascinating is that young children, maybe around 5 or 6, seem to be blind to bias altogether. They don't readily see bias in themselves, nor do they readily attribute it to their peers, even if you explain what biased behavior looks like.
So they think everyone's playing fair, including themselves.
Pretty much. They might understand that being biased is bad, like they know a teacher wouldn't like it, but they don't yet make that comparative judgment. Others are biased, but I'm not.
So when does it start to emerge?
It typically kicks in during middle childhood, often between 7 and 12 years old. And its emergence seems tightly linked to a major cognitive development, the maturation of their theory of mind.
Theory of mind, that's understanding that other people have minds, thoughts, beliefs.
Exactly. But specifically, it's linked to developing a more sophisticated, interpretive, or constructivist theory of mind. This usually happens around age 7 or 8. It's the point where kids start to grasp that beliefs aren't just direct copies of reality. They understand that minds actively interpret or construct reality.
Ah, so they realize that different people can see the same thing differently because their minds are building different interpretations.
Precisely. This leap is crucial. Once they understand that minds construct reality, they gain the capacity to think that other people's constructions might be skewed or influenced by factors other than pure objective fact. That's the seed of perceiving bias in others.
But they don't apply that same logic to their own minds because of the introspection illusion.
That seems to be exactly it. They develop this sophisticated understanding of how other minds work and can be influenced, but when they look inward, their own mind still feels like it's directly perceiving reality. Naive realism. And introspection reveals no bias. Introspection illusion. So the asymmetry is born. They start seeing bias out there, but remain blind to it in here.
That's fascinating. It implies there might be a window then, before it gets locked in.
Potentially, yes. Since young kids understand biased behavior is undesirable, Maybe interventions could focus on helping them connect that understanding to their own actions before the full blind spot develops, helping them apply the same scrutiny to themselves that they're starting to apply to others. It could, maybe, lead to adults who are a bit better at self-correction.
Building that self-awareness muscle early on, that could have huge implications down the line.
Okay, so this isn't just some abstract psychological quirk. It sounds like it has really serious consequences. If we're all walking around basically convinced of our own objectivity while seeing bias in everyone who disagrees, where does that lead? What are the real-world problems this blind spot creates?
Oh, the consequences are massive. It's a major driver of friction at all levels, interpersonal, professional, political. It really poisons the well for cooperation and understanding.
How so? Can you break that down? Well, think about what happens when disagreement arises. Because of naive realism, you think your view is objective reality. Because of the bias blind spot, you assume the other person's disagreement must stem from their bias or irrationality.
Right. They're just not seeing it clearly because they're whatever the bias is.
Exactly. And that attribution, they're biased, often triggers a more aggressive or dismissive response from you. Why engage seriously with someone you think is irrational or ideologically blinded?
Yeah, you might just shut down or attack their motives.
Precisely. But then your aggressive or dismissive response looks irrational and biased to them, which confirms their suspicion that you're the biased one. And down you go into this negative spiral. Researchers call it the spiral of conflict.
Wow. Each side's perception of the other's bias just fuels the fire.
Constantly, it makes negotiation feel pointless. Why try to find common ground with someone you see as a fanatic or completely unreasonable, rather than just someone with a different, but perhaps equally valid, perspective?
That sounds depressingly familiar, especially thinking about politics today. Does the blind spot directly fuel political polarization?
Absolutely. There is strong research evidence for this. The more political partisans attribute bias to their opponents, they only believe that because they watch Fox News, or they only think that because they read the New York Times, the more polarized they themselves become over time.
So blaming the other side's bias actually makes you more extreme.
Yes. It predicts increases in their own polarization, becoming more closed-minded, and developing greater animosity towards the other side. It's a vicious cycle. The blind spot helps lock people into their echo chambers.
And it must completely hamstring actually solving problems, right? If everyone thinks they're objective and the other side is the problem.
It's a massive obstruction. How can you reach a compromise if both sides genuinely believe they hold the objective truth and the other side is fundamentally irrational or acting in bad faith due to bias? You're less likely to concede anything, less likely to trust proposals from the other side, and you might even reject solutions offered by neutral mediators if they don't align perfectly with your objective view. It undermines the entire process of finding common ground.
Okay, the general picture is pretty bleak. Can you give us some specific, concrete examples, like in different jobs or fields where this really causes tangible harm?
Definitely. The research provides some really stark case studies across fields where objectivity is supposed to be crucial. Let's start with forensics.
Okay, crime labs, evidence analysis, crucial stuff.
Hugely crucial. Now, a big study looked at forensic examiners from over 20 countries. About 71%, nearly three-quarters, acknowledge that cognitive biases in general are a problem in their field. Things like, letting your liking for a defendant influence your assessment, or letting initial expectations guide how you analyze a fingerprint.
So most agree bias is a potential issue for the field.
Yes. But when asked if these biases affected their own judgments, only 26% thought so.
Wow. That is a massive gap. 71% see the general problem, but only about a quarter see it in themselves.
Exactly. And you can imagine how this plays out. If researchers publish studies showing bias in forensic analysis, examiners with a large blind spot might resist those findings intensely. They might see it as a personal attack, not as valuable information for improving the system, because they feel they're objective.
It blocks improvement. Okay, what about another high-stakes area like investing?
Oh yeah, finance is rife with potential biases. Things like wishful thinking, buying a stock because you want it to go up, not based on solid analysis. Or escalation of commitment, throwing good money after bad, maybe because you already invested so much time or ego in it.
Right, the sunk cost fallacy.
That kind of thing. Now, studies show that even professional investment fund managers, people who understand these behavioral biases intellectually, often fail to see how they apply to their own investment decisions. They think they're rational, they're seeing the market clearly, while other investors are driven by fear and greed.
And individual investors too, I bet.
Same story. People tend to believe their own stock picks are based on logic, while other people's choices are just emotional or naive. This collective denial can really impact market behavior, contribute to bubbles, prolonged downturns.
Okay, what about the legal system? You mentioned courts rely on people self-diagnosing impartiality.
Yes, and that's a huge vulnerability.
Mm.
Think about juries. They're often asked during selection, can you be fair and unbiased? And they usually say yes, sincerely believing it.
Mm-hmm.
But studies using mock jurors show a clear bias blind spot. You expose them to prejudicial information before the trial. Maybe news reports about the defendant's past crimes, stuff they're not supposed to consider. They'll insist it won't affect their judgment, that they can set it aside and be objective.
But does it?
Their actual verdict judgments show they are significantly biased by that pre-trial publicity, despite their claims of objectivity. So the very premise that people can accurately gauge their own impartiality is fundamentally flawed because of the bias blind spot.
That's deeply worrying for justice. What about human resources? Hiring? Promotions? That's where bias can lead to huge inequalities.
Absolutely. Fairness, equity, getting the best talent, it all depends on minimizing bias. But HR professionals themselves show the blind spot. Studies find they view other HR people as much more susceptible than they are to common hiring biases.
Like what kind of biases?
Things like in-group favoritism, maybe preferring candidates who went to the same university or share a hobby, or confirmation bias, looking for evidence that confirms their initial impression of a candidate during the interview. Or the halo effect, thinking an attractive candidate must also be more competent.
So they see it in their colleagues, but not so much in themselves.
Exactly. And this is a major reason why proven bias reduction techniques aren't used more widely. Think about blind auditions for orchestras, massively successful at reducing gender bias. But if HR managers don't believe they are susceptible to bias, they won't push for implementing similar blinding procedures for resumes or interviews. They don't see the need for themselves.
It actively prevents adopting solutions. Okay, 2 more critical ones. Medicine.
Medicine is another field with a lot of research here. Doctors' decisions can be swayed by things like how information is framed. We mentioned the survival versus mortality rates for surgery earlier.
Right.
And there's the whole issue of gifts and influence from pharmaceutical companies. Even small gifts, like pens or lunches, have been shown to subtly affect prescribing habits. But ask medical residents. Overwhelmingly, they deny that these gifts influence their patient care decisions, while readily admitting they probably influence their peers.
The classic blind spot pattern again. It affects them, not me.
Precisely. And this makes it incredibly hard to tackle those conflicts of interest effectively, because the doctors themselves often genuinely believe they're immune.
And finally, policing. This is obviously a huge area of public concern regarding bias.
Yeah, and while the sources noted less direct research, specifically asking officers about their self-perception of bias compared to, say, doctors, the underlying principles almost certainly apply. We know from general studies that people see themselves as less biased than others when it comes to things like judging crime scenarios or recalling events.
So it's highly likely the blind spot operates there then.
It's very probable. Given the high pressure, often ambiguous situations police face, relying solely on officers' self-assessment of impartiality is likely insufficient. It really underscores the need for systemic approaches, clear policies, training focused on unconscious bias mechanisms, accountability structures, rather than just asking individuals to be unbiased, because the blind spot makes that self-diagnosis so unreliable.
Okay, this is quite a picture. The blind spot is pervasive, it's rooted in basic psychology, and it causes real harm across so many important areas. So, the million-dollar question, what can we do about it? Why haven't we just, educated everyone about it and fixed the problem?
If only it were that simple. That's the real kicker. With the bias blind spot, trying to fix it head-on often backfires because of the very nature of the problem.
How so?
Well, the most common intuitive approach is, okay, I know biases exist, so I'll just try really hard to be objective, and I'll check myself.
No.
Conscious effort and self-diagnosis.
Yeah, seems logical.
But that relies on introspection. And as we discussed, introspection is where the illusion lies. When you look inward to check for bias, you usually don't find any conscious trace of it.
So what happens?
You conclude you are objective.
Exactly. The attempt to self-correct actually ends up reinforcing your confidence in your own objectivity. It paradoxically strengthens the blind spot.
So trying to fix it directly makes it worse sometimes. It often does, or at least doesn't help. And this is why traditional educational approaches often fall flat too. Just teaching people about different biases, listing them, defining them, doesn't reliably reduce their own bias blind spot.
Even if they learn the information.
Even then. They might get better at spotting those biases in other people. They learn the labels for things they already perceived in others. But applying it to themselves, the self-other asymmetry remains. Especially for people who had a large blind spot to begin with. The information doesn't seem self-relevant because their internal experience tells them, I'm objective.
Man, that is stubborn. Okay, so if direct self-checking and just learning the facts don't work, what does? Are there smarter ways, psychologically wise ways, as you called them, to actually make a dent in this?
Yes, thankfully there are. The strategies that show promise are the ones that cleverly work with or around the underlying psychology instead of fighting it directly.
Okay, like what? Give us some examples.
One really neat technique is what you might call indirect self-reflection, or a wise diagnosis strategy. Instead of asking the doomed question, am I biased? You flip the perspective.
How?
You ask yourself, okay, imagine someone else did exactly what I just did, made the same decision, used the same reasoning in this exact situation. Would I judge that person to be biased?
Ah, so you leverage your skill at spotting bias in others, but apply it to a hypothetical clone of yourself.
Precisely. It forces you to adopt that external perspective on your own actions. And studies show this can genuinely increase self-awareness of bias. It's a way to bypass the unreliable introspection by tricking your brain into using its other judging mode on itself.
That's clever. Very clever. What about making education work better?
Effective education needs to go beyond just listing biases. It needs to teach people about the psychology of the blind spot itself.
Like teaching naive realism and the introspection illusion.
Exactly. Explaining why we have this blind spot, the role of unconscious processes, the fundamental difference in how we judge self versus others. When people understand the mechanisms that create the blind spot, they become more willing to accept that they might be susceptible too. It's not just learning facts. It's gaining insight into the flaws in your own perceptual machinery.
So understanding the why helps you accept the what.
It seems to. Studies where people just read articles explaining how unconscious processes influence judgment showed a reduction in their bias blind spot later.
Interesting. Any other approaches?
Experiential learning shows a lot of promise. Instead of just telling people they're biased, you put them in situations where they directly experience their own perceptions being skewed.
Like?
Well, remember those visual illusion studies, where people look at illusions and literally see their vision being distorted. Afterwards, they showed a reduced bias blind spot on unrelated judgment tasks.
Because they just had undeniable proof that their own perception isn't always accurate.
Exactly. It provides that visceral aha moment. Wow, my brain really does fool me sometimes. That introspection can't easily dismiss. That experience of fallibility seems to generalize, making them a bit less confident in their objectivity overall.
That makes sense. And you mentioned serious video games before. How do they fit into this?
Right. Serious games like Macbeth are a really exciting frontier here. They leverage that experiential learning principle.
How do they work?
They put players in simulated scenarios, maybe intelligence analysis or medical diagnosis, where making biased decisions leads to concrete negative consequences within the game. You lose points, you fail the mission, you get clear feedback saying that was a biased judgment.
So the game provides the objective feedback that introspection fails to deliver.
Precisely. It makes the bias and its costs visible and undeniable.
Yeah.
And the research is really encouraging. Combining this kind of gameplay feedback with some explicit instruction about the biases seems to work well.
Does it last, or do people just revert back afterwards?
That's the crucial finding. Studies showed that repeated play and spending more time in the game didn't just improve knowledge about biases, it led to sustained reductions in the bias blind spot itself. And interestingly, the reduction in the blind spot seemed to last longer, it was more resilient, than just the factual knowledge gained.
Wow, so the experience actually changes the underlying tendency more effectively than just learning facts.
It really suggests that, yes, the interactive, feedback-rich experience seems to help rewire that self-perception in a way that passive learning doesn't.
Okay, these individual level strategies are fascinating. But for really important decisions, policy, legal judgments, hiring, can we solely rely on fixing individuals, or do we need systemic changes too?
That's a vital point. For high-stakes stuff, relying only on individuals overcoming their blind spot is risky. Policy-level solutions that design bias out of the process are often much more effective and reliable.
Like the blind auditions for orchestras.
Exactly. Or a key strategy called pre-committing to decision criteria. This means deciding exactly what objective factors you will base a decision on before you encounter the specific cases or candidates.
So you set the rules before you see who might benefit from them.
Precisely. Like in organ allocation systems, they have clear, preset medical criteria. Or in hiring, deciding before looking at resumes that you'll weight, say, technical skills highest, then relevant experience, then education. You write it down.
And that stops you from shifting the goalposts later.
It helps prevent it. It stops you from unconsciously changing your criteria to favor the candidate you happen to like more personally after you've met them or seen their impressive but maybe less relevant background. It contrasts sharply with the common practice of asking people to justify their decision after they've made it. That post hoc rationalization can actually increase bias and the confidence in it.
Fix the system, not just the person. Makes sense. So looking ahead, what are the big unanswered questions for researchers? Where does the work go from here?
Well, there are definitely exciting avenues. One is continuing to refine those serious games. How do you make them engaging enough that people want to play them repeatedly while ensuring the learning is deep and transfers to the real world? That's a design challenge.
Balancing fun and learning effectively.
Another huge area is early intervention. Can we develop and test programs for kids in that crucial middle childhood window, say 7 to 12, to foster awareness of their own potential biases before the blind spot gets fully cemented? Could that lead to adults who are naturally more self-critical and less prone to naive realism?
That could be transformative if it works.
It really could. And finally, maybe exploring the so-called bright side of the bias blind spot. While it messes up our self-perception, our ability to easily spot bias in others is actually a useful critical thinking skill, right? It stops us from being gullible.
True. We need to evaluate others' claims critically.
So the challenge is, can we somehow leverage that outward-facing bias detector and learn to turn it inward more effectively? Can we consciously activate that judging others mode when evaluating our own thoughts and claims? That's a fascinating open question. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this all up, this deep dive really shows the bias blind spot isn't just some minor mental glitch, is it?
Not at all. It's fundamental. It's deeply woven into how we think, and as we've seen, it has really profound implications.
Yeah, it's this genuine blind spot operates regardless of how smart we are. It shapes our arguments, messes with huge decisions in fields like medicine and law, fuels conflict. It's kind of everywhere.
And it's so stubborn because it blocks the path to self-correction. We keep perpetuating the very biases in ourselves that we're so quick to point out in other people.
But understanding all this, it's not just depressing, right? There's value for us listening right now.
Absolutely. This knowledge is genuinely powerful. Just knowing about the bias blind spot, understanding how it works, is a huge step towards being better informed. It gives you a new lens.
How so?
It helps you navigate disagreements differently, maybe with a bit more humility. It encourages you to question your own certainty sometimes. It can lead to making more careful, robust decisions in your work, your relationships, everywhere. It's more than just facts. It's a tool for clearer thinking.
So as you, our listener, go back out into the world after hearing this, maybe think about that quote from Sophocles that came up in the research. Every man can see things far off, but is blind to what is near.
Yeah, that really captures it, doesn't it?
It does. So the challenge for all of us, maybe, is how can we use these insights to get better at seeing what is near, our own assumptions, our own gut reactions, with the same critical clarity we apply to what is far off in others.
Perhaps trying that mental trick we discussed, consciously pausing and asking, okay, hold on. If someone else said or did exactly what I just did, would I think they might be biased?
It might feel awkward at first, but the answer could be really revealing, couldn't it? It might just be the start of piercing your own blind spot, even just a little.
And that little bit of self-awareness could make a world of difference.